Rex, you're with me.
The wait is over.
Rex never ceases to amaze.
Get ready for the return of Hudson and Rex.
All right, go get her.
With high.
The truth behind Hudson and Rex Season 9 is far worse than anyone expected, because this wasn't just a bad season, this was a complete collapse happening in real time. A show that survived for years, suddenly falling apart from the inside, decisions being made that didn't just hurt the story, they destroyed the trust of the audience. And the scariest part? Most of this didn't happen on screen. It happened behind the scenes, quietly, step by step, until there was nothing left to save. Because when you really break it all down, when you connect every piece, every decision, every ignored warning sign, you start to realize something disturbing. Season 9 wasn't just unlucky, it was the result of a chain reaction that should have been stopped long before it ever reached this point. And now, we're left with a season that exists, but might never be seen. So what actually went wrong behind the scenes? And how did a show with such a loyal fanbase end up here? 105. To understand the disaster of Season 9, you have to go back to the moment everything quietly started to fall apart, and that moment didn't happen in Season 9. It didn't even happen in Season 8. It started earlier, when the foundation of the show was already beginning to crack, and almost nobody realized how serious it was at the time. Because from the outside, Hudson and Rex still looked stable. Episodes were airing, fans were watching, and nothing seemed completely broken. But behind the scenes, things were shifting in a way that would change everything. Creative decisions were no longer being made with the audience in mind. Instead, they were being made with a kind of confidence, almost arrogance, that the show could survive anything. That no matter what changes were made, the fans would stay. And that belief, that one dangerous assumption, became the root of everything that followed. Because what the producers failed to understand was something incredibly simple, but also incredibly important. This show wasn't just a detective, a dog, and a case of the week. It was built on something much more fragile, something much more personal. It was built on connection. The connection between the characters, and more importantly, the connection between the audience and the people on screen. And once that connection starts to weaken, once the audience begins to feel like something is off, it doesn't take much for everything to start collapsing. And that's exactly what began happening. Small changes started appearing first. Subtle shifts in storytelling. Characters behaving differently. Moments that didn't feel as genuine as they used to. And at first, these things were easy to ignore. Easy to explain away. Fans told themselves it was just a rough patch, just a temporary dip in quality. But behind the scenes, those small cracks were getting bigger. Because instead of recognizing the problem, instead of slowing down and asking what wasn't working, the people in charge kept pushing forward. They kept making decisions that moved the show further and further away from what made it special in the first place. And this is where things start to become frustrating, because the warning signs were there. They were clear. They were loud. And they were coming from the very people who had supported the show from the beginning. The fans noticed the changes. They felt the difference. And they started talking about it. Online discussions began shifting. The excitement that once surrounded new episodes slowly turned into concern. Then into criticism. And eventually, into disappointment. But instead of listening, instead of taking that feedback seriously, it was ignored. That decision, to ignore the audience, is one of the biggest reasons Season 9 became a disaster before it even had a chance to succeed. Because when a show stops listening to the people who care about it the most, it loses its direction. It loses its identity. And once that happens, every new decision becomes riskier than the last. Every step forward becomes a step further away from what the show was meant to be. And that's exactly what led into Season 8, the moment where everything changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Because Season 8 wasn't just another season, it was the turning point. The moment where the damage became impossible to hide. The moment where the audience didn't just feel that something was wrong, they knew it. And once that realization hits, once fans lose that sense of trust, it becomes almost impossible to get it back. And that's the position the show found itself in, heading straight into season 9, already weakened, already struggling, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen next. To understand why season 9 turned into such a disaster, you have to go back to the exact moment the show made a decision it could never recover from, the moment it chose to move forward without John Reardon as Charlie Hudson. Because that wasn't just a casting change. That was the moment the identity of Hudson and Rex started to break. And what makes it worse is that this wasn't some sudden, unavoidable situation. This was a slow, deliberate shift that happened while he was going through one of the hardest battles of his life. He was dealing with cancer. He was fighting to recover. And in the middle of all that, the show he had carried for years was already preparing to move on without him. From the outside, it didn't look dramatic at first. There was no big announcement that clearly explained what was happening. No honest conversation with the fans. Instead, everything felt quiet, almost hidden. His presence started to fade. His screen time dropped. His role didn't feel as central as it once was. And at the time, a lot of people didn't question it too deeply. They assumed it was temporary. They assumed things would go back to normal. But behind the scenes, the direction had already changed. The decision had already been made. And this is where the real problem begins. Because when a show like this removes its core character, it doesn't just lose a person, it loses balance. Charlie Hudson wasn't just another detective. He was the emotional center of the story. He was the connection point between the audience and everything happening on screen. The way he interacted with Rex, the way he approached cases, the warmth, the humor, all of that created a feeling that made the show stand out. And once that is gone, you can't just replace it by bringing in someone new and expecting everything to work the same way. But that's exactly what happened. Instead of protecting what made the show special, the producers treated it like something that could easily be swapped out. They moved forward with a new lead, played by Luke Roberts, as if the audience would simply adjust. As if the connection that had been built over years could just transfer to someone else overnight. And that assumption, that belief that the show was bigger than the people who made it work, became the biggest mistake of all. Because the audience didn't react the way they expected. The moment it became clear that Charlie Hudson was truly gone, something changed. The excitement wasn't there anymore. The emotional investment started to fade. And instead of giving the new direction a chance, a large part of the fanbase made a decision almost immediately. They stepped away. Not slowly, not over time, but right away. And that kind of reaction is something you can't easily fix. Once viewers disconnect like that, bringing them back becomes incredibly difficult. What makes this even more frustrating is that the warning signs were impossible to miss. The backlash started early. Social media reactions were filled with confusion, anger, and disappointment. Fans were asking questions that never got answered. Why was this happening? Why wasn't he coming back? Why did it feel like the show was ignoring its own history? And instead of addressing those concerns, there was silence. No clear explanation. No effort to rebuild trust. Just a decision to keep moving forward like nothing was wrong. And that silence did more damage than anything else. Because when people don't understand what's happening, they start filling in the gaps themselves. They start assuming the worst. They start believing that the show doesn't care about them, or about the characters they've spent years supporting. And once that idea takes hold, it spreads fast. It turns disappointment into frustration. Frustration into anger. And anger into something even more dangerous, disengagement. By the time season 8 fully rolled out, the damage was already done. The foundation of the show had been shaken, and the audience was no longer fully on board. And that's the key thing to understand about season 9. It didn't fail on its own. It didn't suddenly collapse for no reason. It was built on top of a version of the show that had already lost its strongest support. A version that had already pushed away a huge part of its audience. And when you start from that position, when the trust is already broken, every new season becomes a risk. So before season 9 even began production, the situation was already fragile. The show was no longer what it used to be. The connection with the audience was weaker. The confidence that once carried it through earlier seasons was gone. And yet, despite all of that, the people behind the scenes decided to keep going. They moved forward as if nothing had changed. As if the problems weren't serious. As if the audience would eventually come back on their own. But that's not how it works. And as we move deeper into what happened next, it becomes clear that this decision, this refusal to stop and fix what was broken, is exactly what pushed Hudson and Rex into a disaster that season 9 could never escape. By the time season 8 fully arrived, the damage that had been building quietly was finally impossible to ignore. This was no longer a small shift or a temporary change.